I began writing this description of my near-death experience on October 6, 2007, 35 years after the experience. My almost drowning experience took place almost a decade and a half before I ever heard the term near-death experience. It was the late spring of 1972 in Kaukauna, Wisconsin, very close to my 17th birthday. I was a senior in high school, and it was the day that seniors received their yearbooks. For some long-forgotten reason, there was no school and yearbooks needed to be picked up during the late afternoon. This gave my best friend since 6th grade and I an excuse to take our visitor from inner-city Philadelphia on a rafting trip down the Wolf River. We drove to Menominee and rented a raft. The water ran high and fast. Being a confident swimmer and having rafted a few times on the same stretch of the river, I was full of that invincible self-confidence, a type of bravado that can affect many teenagers. I neglected to put on my life jacket. We were having a lovely time showing our Philly friend one of the freedoms that small-town kids frequently enjoyed. While floating along the current, we began to pick up speed. Up ahead, a walking bridge crossed the river. We noticed a very old man frantically motioning to us to move over to the left. We couldn't hear a word he was shouting, but he was obviously agitated. We decided that he must be in trouble and needed our help, so we tried to maneuver the raft to the left shoreline. The current fought back, and we strained with all of our might to pull ourselves toward shore. Instead, the raft careened into the mid-span abutment and folded up. We were thrown into the icy springtime flow. My friends and the raft headed right, a fact that I was unaware of until much later, while I headed left and directly into a whirlpool. The whirlpool pulled me under. I couldn't tell which end was up. I was swimming frantically to try to get out and running out of breath, beginning to panic, feeling desperately cold. I couldn't tell if I was swimming up or down. A voice or thought came into my head. It said something like, "Let go. Go with the flow. Let go." I immediately stopped swimming. It felt like a release, surrendering to something greater than myself. There was a deep element of trust involved, an inner feeling that all would be as it should be. Everything went black. My life began to play before my eyes, like a movie made up of vignettes, both snapshots, like a still photograph, and video clips, like the quick movie segments that make up a TV commercial. There wasn't any sound that accompanied them. They progressed in a chronological sequence from birth to my current age. I can still remember a few of the flashes, including, as a toddler, I received my first bee sting by swatting what I thought was a fly on the front porch door screen, viewed from behind. A tantrum I threw on the dining room floor when my mom wanted to go to the grocery store, viewed from a point floating near the ceiling. Getting a lady's electric shaver from my dad for a 16th birthday present, viewed floating above the dining room table. It felt as if the images were flashing, moving, almost dancing directly across my eyelids, similar to what I imagine virtual reality goggles might feel today. This life flashing before my eyes experience happened very quickly. I can only guess it was a matter of seconds. At a later point in time, I questioned my mother about the early flashbacks that were not a part of my current memory. I did indeed swat a bee at about age 3, and threw an enormous tantrum at the foot of my mom's old tread pedal sewing machine that sat in our dining room right around the time that I had started school. Some of the other flashbacks I asked about she did not remember. Then it was dark, complete, and total blackness. I looked side to side and saw more blackness. I thought my eyes were closed, so I consciously checked to make sure they were open. The voice inside my head said, "Turn around." And when I did, I saw a pinprick of light. I remember thinking, I'm in a cave. And then the calm, persistent thought urged me to move toward the light. It reassured me to be unafraid. It was smooth, slow, peaceful, and without a sound, like floating. I don't recall making any effort to move my body. I mere glided along through the dark. Looking around me, I would occasionally see people. I saw an older man walking along with a burro. I saw my grandpa, my dad's father, who had been dead for a number of years. I saw other people that were heading in both directions, some slowly, some merely a blur. The light at the cave entrance grew larger and larger the closer I got to the mouth. It was incredibly bright, unlike the light of day, that often has a tint to it, and this particular light was pure white. As I entered the light, I was surrounded by an immediate feeling of ultimate peace. I was home. I was surrounded by pure love and acceptance. I was fully connected to this peace and love. The closest I have come to feeling this sensation again has been at the birth of my 2 children. A thought came into my head. It asked me why I was here so soon. The thought was surprised by my appearance. I was unsure, uneasy. I was becoming disoriented, thinking to myself, where am I? What is this place? The thought in my head sensed this uneasiness, and as if it were reading my mind, began to reassure me that I was fine, that I was somewhere that was safe, and redirected me to the feelings of peace and love that I had originally felt. I felt at ease, but I was curious and confused. Thinking back, can you really read my mind? The thought seemed to realize that I needed a more concrete way to communicate in order to feel completely comfortable. So the thoughts came into my head. What kind of form or shape would make you most comfortable? What do you mean? I thought back. Some require me to take the shape of a wise old man, others a woman, and still others an animal, all of different races, ages, sizes, or species. What about you? I thought without hesitation. Human. With that, the light began to simultaneously separate into amazing rays of color and intensify into a more solid form. Once the light reached the stage where it looked like a human form, a rather generic-looking cookie-cutter shape, like a gingerbread man, I thought, that is enough, I am comfortable with this form. The shape could move and was 3-dimensional. It was composed entirely of light, and rays of luminescent color emanated from every part of it. I saw the color again, many years later, when I first saw iridescent material. The feelings of safety, love, and peace were even greater in its presence. We were still communicating through thoughts. This being wanted to know what voice I required, man, woman, child, etc. I chose that of a man. An interesting choice to analyze at this point in my life. I don't recall any communication about what language to use. I wanted to know what to call this light form. It began to tell me some of the many names for God that our world cultures use. I interrupted. God worked for me. Even if I wasn't sure at that time in my life if I even believed in God. Whatever the light truly was, I recognized it as a pure energy form. I never actually called it God, but I also recognized that many of the people I knew would have called it that. We began to communicate. Where was I? Home, familiar place, somewhere I had been many times before. What was I doing here? The light wanted to know. I wanted to know too. I was told that I was too early. I still had work to do. What work? I would be able to figure that out. I would have to go back. I didn't want to. I really wanted to stay. I was immensely saddened. I understood that it was my duty and that I wouldn't be asked to do it if I wasn't capable. I realized that I must go back, but I was afraid. The light provided me with an escort to guide me safely back. I was still reluctant to leave, but felt comforted by my guide. While in college, I continued to relive this rafting experience in my dreams. My guide appeared to me in my dreams as my grandpa, my mother's father, who had died just a little over a year before the raft trip. I took a moment to bask in the all-encompassing love, peace, and pure light before I turned ready to go. I quickly traveled back into the darkness of the cave. It seemed like faster than the speed of light. I don't remember seeing anyone as I traveled through the darkness. The next second, I was back in my body, and I popped out of the darkness and up to the surface of the whirling river, where I was able to take a breath of air rather than water for the first time. Everything that had happened to me could only have taken place in a minute or two. I was released from the whirlpool, and the current was taking me quickly into a series of rapids. I was ready to fight for my survival. In realizing that unless I turned myself around so that my legs pointed downstream, I would most certainly bash my head on a boulder and be a goner, I began to navigate so that my legs were in front of me. I was relying on information that I had once heard on a television or radio show that was promoting motorcycle helmets. It mentioned that you can live with broken legs, but not a squashed brain. It's funny what you think of in an emergency. Now I was like a log floating through the rapids, but I still couldn't use my arms effectively to save myself. I decided that I must roll over onto my stomach. I thought that even though it would be harder to pull my head up for air, I would be able to use my hands to grasp onto something or maneuver closer to the side of the river. I floated like this for a while. I would use a butterfly stroke to pull my head out of the rapids to take a breath, and then try to grab onto rocks as I rushed by. After what seemed like an eternity and many tries, my technique was successful. I snagged a boulder small enough to wrap my arms around and shallow enough that I could lift my head high enough to not suck in the rushing water. I rested there for a while, my legs and body too exhausted to stand, my lungs aching from the water I had inhaled. The water averaged around a foot in depth, with some deep pockets and some places a mere 8 inches. I eventually stood and struggled clumsily over to the side. I was thrown to the right bank, which had actually flooded. I held onto the small trees and shrubs that were covered with about a foot of water. The river was not only high, but it had actually flooded. This was when I first thought about my friends. Were they alive? Where could they be? The blush of spring had been a sight to behold at the start of this trip, but at that moment, when I was safe and could begin thinking about others, the planet took on a whole new color scheme. The sky, the trees, the leaves, the river all glowed with the light from within that I had seen while trapped inside that whirlpool. The greens were greener, the blues bluer, and the browns were browner. It was as if everything were alive. Even inert objects like rocks and water and sky, they all pulsed with life. This feeling stayed with me for weeks, but was never as intense as at that moment. I walked upstream, aided by the small trees and shrubs. I held onto their trunks and branches as I fought the current rushing past my feet. I searched the shoreline and bushes for any evidence that my friends were near. I prayed, hoping that I didn't find any bodies. The sound of the rapids got louder. I could finally make out the footbridge. There to the left, standing squarely in the area that the old man on the bridge had so feverishly tried to get us to avoid, stood my 2 friends holding the raft. They jumped up and down, hugging one another and screaming once they spotted me. Behind them was a small dam or spillway. It would have been about a 3-foot drop into a relatively calm pool if our raft had just naturally gone that direction. All of our struggling to stop and help the old man on the bridge appeared now to be from his attempt to get us to avoid the drop and go along the more gradual, natural course of the river. The raft had the bottom ripped out of it. After many hugs, we sat on the raft walls, dangling our feet, and began floating along. Trying to regain our belongings, we fished out shoes, my life jacket, and the paddles. Everything was accounted for with the exception of items so minor that I can't remember missing them. The most amazing recovery of all was my glasses. While in the whirlpool, I still had my hands on the paddle. I made a decision to let go of the paddle in order to swim. My glasses were on my head, but I thought to myself, oh no, if I lose my glasses, my mother will be furious. So I took them off and held on to them throughout the entire experience. I can't even imagine what the owner of the raft company thought when he picked us up at the designated spot, but at least my mom never yelled at me. I don't know if this is a true near-death experience, since I have never had another one, or ever met anyone who had a documented near-death experience. I didn't actually die and have someone revive me, but I am assuming this is at least similar to what a near-death experience is. I always called this an I fell in a river and had hypothermia that played funny tricks on my brain experience until I started to read about near-death. At this point, I am curious to learn more.